Water cascaded over her shoulders, washing away the weariness of recent sleepless nights. Steam swirled beneath the marble vaults of the private baths, transforming everything into a milky haze. The oil, warm, fragrant, with the barely perceptible scent of lavender, absorbed into her skin slowly, leaving a sensation of silkiness. The servant's hands massaged stiffened muscles. First the neck, where tension accumulated from long hours tending the sacred fire. Then the shoulders, the back, each vertebra. Cornelia closed her eyes, allowing herself this rare moment of bodily repose. The touches were professional, devoid of any intimacy, yet her body responded gratefully, relaxing, thawing, as if remembering that it was alive. Droplets of water trickled down her collarbones, glided along her arms, disappeared into the folds of her linen tunic. Somewhere in the distance, a quiet murmur could be heard. Water overflowing from a marble basin into the pool, a measured, lulling sound. She had been a Vestal for 12 years, half of her service. Her body had long grown accustomed to the severity of white garments, to the weight of the infula upon her brow, to the coolness of marble beneath bare feet. Accustomed to never being touched by masculine hands, never caressed by glances, never disturbed by desire. It had become a temple, a vessel for sacred duty. But now, in this humid warmth, where boundaries dissolved in vapor, where the servant's touches awakened her skin to life, Cornelia suddenly sensed something forgotten. Not desire. No. Rather, a memory that her body had once been simply the body of a girl who could laugh, run through her father's garden, feel the wind in her hair, unhidden by a veil. "Mistress, are you ready?" The servant's voice returned her to reality. Cornelia opened her eyes. The steam slowly dispersed. Through the high, narrow window, a ray of sunlight pierced through, cutting the semi-darkness with a golden blade. Time to return to the fire. She did not know that in 3 days, this fire would be extinguished. That in a week, she would be accused of the unthinkable. That in a month, Rome would shudder from an ordeal it had not witnessed for several generations. In ancient Rome, beginning from the legendary times of King Numa Pompilius, the 7th century before the birth of Christ, there existed an institution of priestesses to the goddess Vesta, unequaled in all the ancient world. Vesta, goddess of the hearth and sacred fire, embodied the very essence of Roman statehood. Continuity, stability, the bond between generations. The temple of Vesta on the Roman Forum was a circular sanctuary with a colonnade. Inside, at the temple's center, upon a stone altar, sacred flames burned day and night. Romans believed, as long as this fire lives, Rome exists. If the flame should be extinguished, the empire would fall. Only Vestals were entrusted to guard the eternal fire, priestesses who had taken a vow of chastity for 30 years of service. There were always 6. They selected girls between the ages of 6 and 10 from the noblest patrician families. The requirements were stringent, with both parents alive and in lawful marriage, the father a full citizen, the girl herself perfect in body, without physical defects. The selection ceremony was both solemn and merciless. The Pontifex Maximus would appear at the home of the chosen one. Refusal was impossible. He would pronounce the ancient formula: "I take you, beloved, that you may be a priestess of Vesta, performing sacred rites for the welfare of the Roman people." From that moment, the girl ceased to be her father's daughter. She became the daughter of the goddess. Service was divided into 3 decades: 10 years of apprenticeship, 10 years of service, 10 years of mentoring the younger ones. Upon completion of the term, a Vestal could leave the order, return to the world, marry. But few dared. There existed a belief marriages of former Vestals were unhappy. The gods do not forgive renunciation of sacred duty. In exchange, the Vestals received privileges unprecedented for Roman women. They possessed legal independence, not subject to the authority of father, brother, or husband. They managed property, drafted wills, testified in court. Their oath carried the force of a senator's. At all public spectacles, they were provided the finest seats. When a Vestal appeared on the street, consuls yielded the way. Most astonishing was the privilege of pardon. If a condemned man was being led to execution and the procession encountered a Vestal, the criminal was immediately freed. The meeting was considered a sign from the goddess, the power of life and death in the hands of chaste maidens. But for power, they paid a terrible price. The vow of chastity was sacred and inviolable. Violation was punished by death. The Vestal was buried alive in an underground crypt beyond the city walls. The day began long before dawn. She who stoned to watch the night fire was ending would rise from her bed in complete darkness. Sheets of fine linen chilled the skin. The air in the room was motionless, heavy with nocturnal stuffiness. Bare feet touched the marble floor, and a shiver ran down her spine from the sudden cold. The corridors of the atrium greeted her with pre-dawn coolness. A light draught carried the scent of moist earth and flowering myrtle from the garden. Torches in wall niches burned low, casting trembling shadows on the frescoes. The Vestal walked slowly, her footsteps soundless. The temple greeted her with the breath of living fire. Flames danced upon the altar, casting golden reflections on the columns, on the marble floor, on the painted dome. Heat radiated in waves, pleasant, almost tangible. The Vestal lowered herself to her knees, extended her hands toward the fire. Her palms immediately covered with perspiration, skin tightening from proximity to the flames. But she did not pull away. This was a moment of closeness with the goddess. Intimate, almost physical. The logs exuded the aroma of juniper and oak. New logs needed to be added. She examined each log with her hands, checking for defects, rot, cracks. The wood was dry, warm to the touch, smelled of forest and resin. She selected 3 logs, approached the fire, slowly, with prayer on her lips, placed them into the flames. Sparks soared toward the vault. The fire hungrily embraced the fresh wood, crackled, hissed, blazed brighter. After morning service, ablution. The water was cool, slightly warm, a temperature that awakened the body from sleep. The Vestal removed her night tunic, her body, slender, strong, but never having known a masculine gaze, covered with goose flesh in the cool air. She took a sponge, dipped it in the basin, squeezed it over her shoulders. Water streamed down her skin, leaving wet trails. Then oil, just a little, light, almost without scent, rubbed along her arms, legs, abdomen. The skin absorbed it hungrily, becoming soft, glowing in the dawn light. Dressing was a ritual. First, the undertunic of fine linen. The fabric glided over moist skin, chilled, embraced the body. Then the stola, a long woolen tunic, white as freshly fallen snow. It had to be draped in a particular manner, fastened with fibulae, bronze clasps. The metal was cold, heavy. Over this, the palla, a covering draped over shoulders and head. And finally, the infula, a white woolen band for the forehead with long ribbons. This was the sign of priestly dignity. Breakfast took place in the communal dining hall. Servants brought simple fare, bread, fresh with a crispy crust and soft crumb smelling of yeast and wheat. Olive oil, thick, golden green, tart, honey, viscous, amber, sweet, fresh fruit. They ate in silence or conversed in hushed tones. Training lasted years. The younger Vestals mastered complex rituals. They learned to prepare mola salsa, sacred salted flour for sacrifices. Spelt grains were ground by hand with stone millstones mixed with coarse sea salt, sifted through fine linen sieves. The flour was coarse, scratched the fingers. They learned to weave. The shuttle glided between threads with a quiet click. Fingers tightened the weft. The wooden comb beat the row. The movements became meditative. Woolen threads were soft, slightly oily, smelled of sheep and lanolin. They studied writing and law. The Vestals were guardians of the most important state documents. In the library, where it smelled of old papyrus, wax tablets, and cedar oil, the younger ones mastered the art of reading ancient texts. But not everything was asceticism and study. The Vestals attended theaters, were present at gladiatorial games. In the Colosseum, they had a separate box. When a gladiator fell, the emperor sometimes turned to the Vestals, awaiting their sign. Thumb raised upward, life, lowered, death. In the evening, when the sun declined toward the hills and the forum plunged into golden violet twilight, the Vestals gathered in the garden of the atrium. They sat on marble benches by the fountain, listened to the splash of water, breathed in the fragrance of myrtle and laurel. Sometimes they conversed, sometimes they remained silent. The air cooled slowly, the stone beneath bare feet releasing the warmth accumulated during the day. The fire was extinguished at dawn on the 27th day of the month of May. Marcia was supposed to be on watch, the youngest Vestal, a girl of 15 years. She dozed off, only for an instant. When she awakened, the temple was cold. The flame had vanished. On the altar remained only smoldering coals, rapidly graying in the pre-dawn darkness. Her scream awakened the entire atrium. Cornelia sprang up, her heart pounding wildly. She threw her covering over her night tunic, ran barefoot into the corridor. In the temple, it smelled of smoke and something else. Fear, desperation. Marcia knelt before the extinguished hearth, sobbing, clawing at the altar stone with her hands. Blood flowed from beneath her nails. Vestia Maxima, the eldest priestess, acted swiftly. She ordered them to bring the sacred lens, a special glass with which, in emergency cases, they were permitted to kindle fire from the rays of the rising sun. They opened the temple doors, admitting the first rays of dawn. The eldest Vestal stood before the altar, raised the lens, caught the sunbeam. The light focused on tinder. Seconds passed. The tinder began to smoke. A spark appeared, then a tiny flame. The fire lived again, but the news had already spread across the forum. By midday, all Rome knew. The sacred fire had been extinguished. The priestesses had defiled their service. The goddess was wrathful. 3 days later, Vestia Maxima was summoned to the Senate. She returned aged 10 years in a single day. The Senate demands an investigation. Marcia will be tried, but the senators are not certain she alone is guilty. They say the fire cannot be extinguished just like that this is a sign that among us there is one who violated the vow of purity, and the gods are punishing Rome for this defilement. Cornelia felt the world sway. Accusation of breaking the vow, incestum, the most terrible crime. Interrogations began the following day. Cornelia was summoned third. They led her through the forum under escort of lictors. The crowd was silent, but their gazes burned her back. Usually the crowd bowed to a Vestal. Now they looked with suspicion, with fear. In the curia, the pontiffs awaited her. 5 elders in togas with purple borders. The Pontifex Maximus sat in the center. Cornelia, you are accused of defiling the sacred vow of purity. What do you say in your defense? She stood straight, not lowering her gaze. I am pure before the goddess. I have not violated my vow. I swear by the sacred fire. The oath of the defiled holds no power. Then test me. Ancient law permits trial by water. If I am guilty, the water will reject me. If innocent, the gods will protect. The pontiffs exchanged glances. Trial by water had not been conducted for 100 years, but they could not refuse. They led her to the Tiber. All Rome poured onto the riverbanks. They stripped Cornelia, removed her white garments, leaving only a thin linen tunic. The fabric clung to her body, outlining every line. They bound her hands behind her back, tied a heavy stone to her feet. The water was ice cold. They pushed her from the bridge. Cornelia submerged, feeling the cold pierce through completely. Darkness surrounded her from all sides. Her lungs burned, demanding air. The stone dragged her down toward the bottom. The current spun her, struck her against underwater rocks. She did not resist. If the gods had decided she was guilty, so be it. But something within rebelled. She was not guilty. She had not violated her vow, not once in 12 years. She had given the goddess everything. Childhood, youth, the right to love, the right to be a woman. Her lungs were tearing, consciousness dimmed. But suddenly, someone's hands seized her, pulled her upward. She surfaced, gasping greedily for air. Water streamed down her face, stung her eyes. They dragged her onto the shore, freed her from the ropes. Cornelia lay on the stones, coughing, choking on water. Her body trembled from cold and shock. Someone threw a cloak over her. Hands, warm, careful, helped her sit. She raised her gaze. Before her stood a young tribune. His face sun-darkened, hair dark, wet from spray. Eyes brown, full of some fierce determination. "You're innocent," he said loudly, so the entire crowd could hear. "The gods sent me to save you. This is a sign," the crowd murmured. The Pontifex Maximus raised his hand, demanding silence. "The trial is not complete. She was pulled out before the gods rendered their verdict. I pulled her out, the tribune stepped forward. And I take responsibility upon myself. If she's guilty, execute us both. But I declare, this woman is pure. And I demand a new investigation." Cornelia looked at him, not understanding. Who was he? Why did he save her? The pontiffs hesitated. The crowd was dangerous. If the people decided the Vestal was being judged unjustly, a riot could begin. The Pontifex Maximus slowly nodded. "A new investigation will be conducted." The investigation lasted 2 weeks. They interrogated servants, gatekeepers, merchants from the forum. They verified every movement of the Vestals over the past year. They found nothing. Cornelia was pure. All 6 Vestals were pure. The fire had been extinguished due to Marcia's negligence, nothing more. The verdict was announced publicly. Marcia was sentenced to public flogging. The others were exonerated. When Cornelia emerged from the atrium, the crowd was silent. Then someone began to applaud. Others joined in. Soon the entire forum thundered with applause. At the temple of Vesta, the tribune awaited her. He stood apart from the crowd, leaning against a column. Seeing her, he straightened. Their gazes met. The moment lasted an eternity. Cornelia stopped. Etiquette required that he avert his gaze. But he did not look away. He looked directly at her, and in his eyes was something that made everything inside contract. She should have walked past, not noticed, not responded to that gaze. She was a Vestal, daughter of the goddess, Inviolate, but her lips trembled in a barely perceptible smile. Gratitude, appreciation, nothing more. He understood, nodded, and turned away. Cornelia entered the temple. The fire burned steadily, calmly. Everything had returned to its place. Life continued, but something had changed forever. In that moment when his hands pulled her from the water, when their gazes met on the bridge, when she smiled at him by the temple. Had she violated her vow? No. Not in body, not in action, but in thought. Yes. In desire. Yes. In the depths of her soul, where the laws of the pontiffs and the gaze of the gods could not reach, she had felt what a Vestal was forbidden to feel. Attraction, longing, human weakness. She never saw the tribune again. She learned later he had been sent to a distant province to command a legion on the frontier, quickly, quietly, without explanation. Cornelia served another 18 years. She became Vestia Maxima after the death of the elder priestess. She led the order wisely and justly. Her name was inscribed on marble tablets, her statue placed in the garden of the atrium. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, when she sat by the fountain and listened to the splash of water, she remembered the cold of the Tiber, the hands saving her from death, the gaze full of forbidden tenderness, the instant when she was not a Vestal, but simply a woman. And that instant was worth more than all the privileges of Rome. The story of Cornelia is one of many preserved in the annals of Rome. The institution of the Vestals existed for more than 1,000 years, from the legendary times of the kings to the end of the 4th century of our era, when Emperor Theodosius I abolished all pagan cults. Over these centuries, hundreds of women passed through the atrium of Vesta. Approximately 20 cases of execution of Vestals for violation of their vow are known. The execution was ritualistic and terrible. The guilty one was dressed in burial garments, placed in closed litters, and carried to the Colline Gate. There, beyond the city wall, was an underground crypt. The Vestal was lowered inside, left with a lamp, a pitcher of water, a little bread. Then the entrance was sealed, buried alive. But there were other stories too. Vestals who served honestly for 30 years and retired surrounded by honor. Those who used their power to save the innocent, stopped processions to places of execution, granted pardons. Those who guarded state secrets influenced politics from the shadows. They were a living paradox of Roman civilization. Women who gained power at the cost of renouncing femininity. Chaste maidens who possessed political rights on par with men. priestesses whose inviolability was absolute until the moment it was violated. Their bodies belonged to the goddess, their lives to Rome. Their thoughts, feelings, desires were supposed to be as pure as the sacred flame, but they were human, and therein lay their tragedy and greatness. Modern historians struggle to understand the Vestals. Some see them as victims, girls deprived of choice, locked in a gilded cage of privileges. Others romanticize their image, chaste guardians of tradition. Both extremes oversimplify reality. The Vestals were strategists who survived in a world where women had no voice. They transformed forced celibacy into a source of power. They used religious authority to influence politics. They preserved dignity in a system that stripped them of the right to be simply women. Their story is not about sacrifice and not about sanctity. It is about the price of power, about what must be surrendered for the right to have a voice, about the impossible choice between freedom and humanity. The last Vestal left the atrium in the year 394 of our era. Christianity had become the state religion. Pagan temples were closing one after another. The sacred fire was extinguished forever, not from negligence, but by imperial decree. The atrium of Vesta turned to ruins. Today on the Roman Forum, only fragments of columns remain, bases of statues, foundation stones. Tourists pass by, not knowing what stories these stones preserve. Not sensing how here, 2,000 years ago, 6 women in white garments carried a burden the equal of which no woman in the ancient world had known. But if you come here at dawn, when the forum is still empty, when the sun is only just coloring the marble rose, when the air is cool and motionless, you can almost hear it. The rustle of white garments, quiet footsteps on stone, the crackling of sacred fire, the beating of hearts of those who gave everything for power they were never permitted to use for themselves. The Vestals have vanished, but the question they embodied remains. What price is a person willing to pay for power? And is power worth renouncing the very essence of one's human nature? Each finds the answer for themselves. Cornelia found hers in that single instant by the temple, when she allowed herself to be not a priestess, but a woman, when she chose not power, but humanity, if only for a moment, if only in a glance. And that moment saved her from oblivion. So there you have it, the whole truth about Rome's inviolate guardians. It turns out that behind those snow-white garments were not victims, but true strategists, women who transformed forced celibacy into unprecedented power. Imagine they could save a person from execution with a single gesture. Their word carried more weight than a consul's command. But what price did they pay for this freedom? If the story of the Vestals moved you, leave your thoughts below the video. It inspires us to keep unearthing forgotten truths. Click the bell to be the first to discover new secrets of antiquity. Soon we'll open another forbidden page of the past about women whose names were erased from the chronicles, but whose influence changed the course of empires. See you in the next episode.